Hey everybody, Socialist Lynx here. Sorry if the environment sounds weird where I'm at. I'm at a different setup place, and I have my computer and my recording little thing set up here. And if you saw the title of this video, this is, a response to, Hakim and his recent video on commodity production and commodity production, and the question of whether or not commodity production exists in socialism. And I'm going to give an introduction here. Basically, the entirety of the video is, just on the question if commodity production even exists in socialism, whether or not what we should constitute as commodity production, or what is commodity production, all these essential functions, and how is essentially commodity production entirely into the betterment of the workers, or is it even able to be for the betterment of the workers? That's basically what the question of that video is essentially there, and I feel, well, from what I can understand, not even from what I feel, but from what I can understand from Marx's, Engels, and Lenin's perspective, from an actual Marxist perspective, he has some flawed ideas. He has some flawed, ideas of commodity production, or at least commodity production in socialism, and possibly just a socialism as an economic structure in itself, which I already covered enough on, and I've already recommended videos on as well. Again, check it out to the right. There probably should be like the workers' state, or like a horrible interpretation, or any of that. But you can check that out of my video about socialism and all these functions if you like. But without further ado, let's get started. I also would like a brief kind of explanation. Although I am a Trotskyist, I do consider myself a Trotskyist in all of these essential functions. I do have the distinction of a neo-Trotskyist, basically the guy that people that essentially believe that we should not support the USSR in times of war, and that we believe entirely that the Soviet Union is either bureaucratic collectivist or state capitalist. I am going under the assumption that this is state capitalism. So keep in mind, not many Trotskyists would agree with me here. But honestly, I'm Lynx, so I don't really give a fuck. So keep in mind, this is not entirely of all Trotskyist theory, and not all Trotskyists would agree with me of what I have to say here about commodity production not being entirely a part of the workers' state. But either way, let's get started.
What is commodity production? In essence, any product of labor made for exchange is a commodity. As Lenin put it, a commodity is, in the first place, a thing that satisfies a human want. In the second place, it is a thing that can be exchanged for another thing. This is in line with Marx's chapter on commodities in Capital Volume 1. In that case, then, what is commodity production? Commodity production is production for exchange on the market. As you can imagine, commodity production came into existence with the emergence of a certain set of material conditions, and with changing material conditions, commodity production changed too. Initially, within primitive society, there was little to no commodity production. With innovation and the development of the productive forces of primitive man, the conditions for simple commodity production took form. The product of individual labor, with simple trade of occasional small surplus of, for example, farm produce, is the starting point of said simple commodity production. As this was a result of mostly individual labor, the amount of labor time and other conditions varied between producers, but the market price remained the same. Whether it took you, a wheat farmer in Mesopotamia, 2 weeks or 1 week to cut and bring to market a single bushel of wheat does not matter, as both bushels, assuming they are of similar quality, would have been set for the same price on the market. Continuing this thread into feudalism, the differing conditions and labor time going into the production of commodities would result in, over a long period of time, polarization, where, on one hand, a smaller number of people accumulate commodities, money, etc., which can be turned into capital, and on the other hand, a large group of people would end up being outcompeted on the market, forcing them into bankruptcy and the sale of their labor power as a last resort. This rudimentary overview leads into capitalist commodity production. Within capitalist commodity production, those that have accumulated capital, meaning capitalists, maintain private ownership of the means of production. With capitalists firmly holding employment within their hands, workers have to sell their labor power to capitalists in return for a wage. From the sale of labor power by the worker to the capitalist, work is done and there occurs capitalist exploitation resulting in the extraction of surplus value. Essentially, labor power itself becomes a commodity. This is, in simple terms, wage labor. This did not exist under feudalism or slave society, and weird controversy existed in some form in pre-capitalist formations in the Greater West Asia and North Africa region, as well as East Asia, which is a topic for another video. Since we have established that commodity production existed in various forms during different socioeconomic conditions, essentially meaning under different material conditions, would
Alright, so I just wanted to essentially kind of like stop that and essentially continue on to that video of explaining commodity production, because I wanted to basically say I don't necessarily disagree with everything he's saying here. However, one, he's implying that capital is entirely the accumulation of money, or essentially money being accumulated. That is not the case. Capital, essentially under the understanding of capital, as far as we are aware of in the Marxist context, is the entirety of the accumulation of labor. The accumulation of labor is essentially translated into money, and essentially a surplus being stolen entirely based onto the amount of worker, like the amount of like actual labor value that they essentially put in for a product. That is essentially the understanding of capital in that instance, and the entirety of capital essentially consists with only the means of substance and the instruments of labor, the raw materials and the material products. It consists onto much of exchange values, all products of which consist are commodities. Capital consequently is not only a sum of material products, it is a sum of commodities, of exchange values, of social magnitudes. Capital remains the same whether we put cotton in the same place of wool, rice in the same place of wheat, steamships in the same place of railroads, provided only that the cotton, rice, and steamships, the body of capital, have the same exchange value and the same price as the wool, the wheat, and all these essential functions. Sorry about that. The entirety of capital is just the various functions of, well, the accumulation of labor. That's essentially what capital is. It's not essentially money being accumulated exactly. It's the entirety of, essentially, money in itself is a medium of exchange. That's exactly what, that is what money is. And as for the understanding of capital in this instance, yes, the capital has essentially been generalized to an extent where essentially workers get paid a wage. They essentially sell their labor power to entirely the capitalist. The capitalist pays them a wage based onto the labor time and the labor value that they essentially put into a product, and on the time of day for that labor that they put in. And because of so they essentially have to do the math to allocate for kind of resources and positions and products that like they themselves have to buy for the next workday, and that they themselves can get profit and also pay the workers as well based onto that profit. Basically every day you have to basically do math to essentially pay your workers, which is very much the case in our modern day standards. So yeah. And because of that, since production is entirely production for exchange value, which is exactly what commodity production is. That's how commodity production is defined within the Marxist theory. This essentially does constitute a capital. Nevertheless, it facilitates a capital regardless. Because if commodity production is entirely production for exchange value, then exchange value essentially facilitates kind of like a capital, and essentially can be and essentially has to have workers working into those production lines for exchange value to even have, for exchange value to essentially constitute itself within the entirety of an economical structure, which is exactly kind of like what the Soviet Union had, and was very much capitalistic in a very formal way. But this is actually where Hakim actually gets into the idea if commodity production exists in socialism, which even then the Soviet Union wasn't even socialist. So, and if you want more. Yeah, and essentially, if you want to understand where I get into this, then again, the entirety of the video cards is up there for you to watch if you'd like. But anyways, let's continue on to the rest of the video.
Would commodity production continue, albeit under a different form, under socialism? This is where lived experience of socialism enters, challenging certain theoretical conceptions prior to socialist experiments existing, and adding a healthy coat of controversy, and boy do we love controversy. Historically, within socialist societies, commodity production of a different kind did exist, primarily due to certain limiting factors. Foremost amongst these reasons is simply circumstance, and the development and success of certain revolutionary movements over others. Modifying Lenin, revolution occurs at the weakest links of capitalism, contrary to Marx's assumptions. History has proven Lenin right, and as a result, revolution swept through not highly industrialized imperial core countries, but agrarian and semi-feudal nations first. Russia, China, Vietnam, Cuba, etc. This resulted in differing contradictions than those assumed within highly industrialized imperial core countries. Russia, for example, had a majority peasant population, and the industrial proletariat was but a slim minority. Immediately, the political course of the
Okay, I just want to get this straight. Basically, whatever you heard from Hakim and just what you heard from Hakim just there was wrong in so many ways. And we're going to go into that detail by detail. First off, he's under the assumption that social societies have even existed in the first place, and that these social societies essentially did have commodity production, or that socialism is not the abolition of classes, or that it does not essentially have classes abolished, which classes being abolished, it means like the entirety of the state and money is also abolished within the entirety of socialism as well, which is something that Marx, Engels, and Lenin essentially defined as well. This is entirely wrong, and this notion that essentially commodities exist in the social society is wrong, and just the fact that even the social society has exist is also wrong. Society is an international relation. When we talk about society, when Marx, Engels, and Vladimir Lenin talks about the society, they're talking about the entirety of the world. They're talking about the world, the entirety of what the world market affects of the entirety of the world. That is society. Okay, what you're describing is entirely of nation states that essentially that have capitalism within it, that essentially draw the map. That is entirely of a nation within a society. That is to understand. That's not societies. Like, we are living under a society. The society being, well, the entirety of the world market that it influences, which is, well, what we can see today as just society as a whole. So this is under the assumption that socialism hasn't even existed in the first place. Two, he essentially kind of like misquotes Lenin, or essentially is misunderstanding what Lenin is trying to say there. In fact, when he essentially gets that quote, capitalists will fall into the weakest links, he's understanding the point that yes, the entirety of the revolution and the entirety of the masses will, and like the entirety of the revolution will have a revolution in the entirety of the more poorer nations and like more non-leading country nations. Marx and Engels did actually agree on that, but the problem is, and the entirety of the criticisms that Marx, Engels, and Lenin did have into that thought, is that this should entirely happen, which is not the case. What they believed, what they understood from that, is that they knew that this is inevitably what happened. There was workers' uprisings in India even before the entirety of the idea, or even before kind of like Marxism essentially would become more popular within that time, before Engels would popularize Marxism. This was beforehand, and because they knew for a fact that would happen. The problem is that they knew that did not have any much power. Their resources have already been extracted to the leading countries, to the more developed nations, and they knew this was going to happen in the first place. And they knew that to understand of what less developed nations, what we can see from India and Vietnam, Cambodia, and etc., all those nations, essentially, of course, they would have revolutions first. But the problem is that when they have those revolutions, they will not have any power, or have any power outside of itself, to essentially get power from other workers into more industrialized nations, where they can actually create entirely of socialism to be a moneyless, classless, stateless society. And we knew that Lenin essentially mean this as well into various quotes as well, essentially brought up by Lenin as well. for this to happen, we cannot essentially understand. We cannot essentially understand, and that this revolution does call for a revolution to be international until capitalism is defeated. And I'd like to make the following quote: in the Economic Errors of the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, quote, "Socialism means the abolition of classes. The dictatorship of the proletariat don't all could to abolish classes, but classes cannot be abolished at one stroke, and classes still remain and will remain in the era of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship will become unnecessary when classes disappear. Without the dictatorship of the proletariat, they will not disappear. Classes have remained, but in the era of the dictatorship of the proletariat, every class has undergone a change of the relations between classes have also changed. The class struggle does not disappear under the dictatorship of the proletariat. It merely assumes different forms." End quote, Vladimir Lenin. He even essentially explains the entire state apparatus of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Quote, "The class of exploiters, the landowners, and capitals has not disappeared and cannot disappear at once under the dictatorship of the proletariat. The exploiters have been smashed but not destroyed. They will still have internal national base in the form of international capital, of which they are branched and still retain certain means of production in part. They still have money. They still have vast social connections. For this, the only way we can achieve socialism is to abolish these very social connections." End quote, Vladimir Lenin. He does say this, and he does essentially constitute for revolution to essentially happen, and he clearly says there that if we are to essentially establish socialism, these things have to be abolished in the first place. So, and the only way to do that is through the means of a permanent revolution, to have the revolution in all the leading countries first, so that way it can help the entirety of other third world nations if they are to have a revolution at all as well. So that is what we have to understand here, and that's the very idea that Lenin, Marx, and Engels are trying to get at there. And this is something that Hakim is misunderstanding from Lenin, obviously. So yeah, that's one thing that we have to understand here. As for the part of mostly peasantry-filled country, this is actually, believe it or not, this is actually not true. The proletariat and the entirety of the peasantry was actually even out by the times of the Russian Revolution essentially happened. It had gone through kind of like a rapid change within society, and essentially, before World War I, before the Imperialist War in 1913, and there was entirely a chart that actually showed this, and is actually presented by Lenin in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, that Russia at the time made up, get this, 40% of the world's capital. 40% of the world's capital at the time of 1913 of Russia. Russia made up 40% of the entire world's capital, like in 1913, despite it being a semi-feudal country, as Stalinists would like to presume. That is huge, especially compared to the world. That is huge for its time, and probably would be huge today. That is huge, and to understand that, we have to. This is capitalist. This is very much capitalist. The only really difference here is that there was a feudal law. You could say there was a feudal law within its essential structure, in Russia. And with this feudal law, yeah, of course, it was essentially a call for agricultural production, all these things. But the peasantry, and and all these essential functions, they still exist, and they were a part of the proletariat, you could say. And they themselves were being accumulated like wage workers in capitalism, in pure capitalist nations. So that's one thing we essentially have to understand here, and that is why we have to understand that yes, it was a semi-feudal country, but it's called semi-feudal for a reason. It is still capitalist, and it still had wage labor, and the entirety of wages was still determined entirely into the peasantry class as well. What we have to understand here. So, and that's exactly what I'm trying to get at. And to understand that like, especially for its time, yeah, no, it's capitalist. It's not just feudalist or semi-feudal. No, it's capitalist. It's very much capitalist. It made up 40% of the entire world's capital. That's huge. That is absolutely huge. Anyways, moving on.
By Lenin's work, The Tax in Kind. establish the peasantry, particularly poor and middle peasants, as an ally class to the proletariat, and maintain harmony between the workers and peasants until sufficient proletarianization can occur within the peasantry through the development of productive forces so that they transition from a private plot peasant production to collective farm production, and then finally to an industrial proletariat within agriculture. This entails a transition from collective farms, a kolkhoz in Russian, to state farms, a sovkhoz, something the USSR was actively doing. Side note, why can't you just proletarianize the peasantry into workers with industrial agricultural farms? Well, this leads into the issues of pragmatism. Peasants in agrarian or semi-feudal societies are intensely attached to their small plots of land, so expropriating and absorbing them into larger industrial farms would
sorry for pausing entirely at this point for a second, but I just wanted to essentially clarify real quick what these essentially ideas of a quote-unquote collective farm essentially is an understanding is that this farm was essentially owned by state and by bureaucrats that essentially were under management and were under the entirety of the control for accumulation during this time of land. This is not collective farming. This isn't like essentially having collective farms. This is essentially farming and entirely with the peasantry and any form of farmer like producing within the lands of Russia essentially, and what they produce essentially goes to a government where they essentially can probably sell their grain entirely to the world market, essentially facilitating capital and essentially creating an abstract class entirely without a physical class in the entirety of mind as a replacement of the bourgeoisie with an instrument of class antagonisms, the state. It's an abstract class. That's exactly what it is, and that's essentially what to understand here of it, being state capitalist, and that is essentially being capitalist within itself. It's when there is entirely the state essentially owning onto the production forces. So, that's facilitating entirely of capital within its regions, and capital being the accumulation of labor, which labor was accumulated within the USSR. That is entirely capitalist. That is very much capitalist. That's not collective farming. That's not collectivism. That is no better than neoliberal countries, other than the fact that you have a planned economy. That's it. You have planned distribution. That's really it. That's all you've done. It's a small partial negation of capitalism. What do you fucking do?
Effectively kill your connection with the peasantry. Add on top of that the usual instability present during early revolutionary periods, and you'd end up with a course of action not only inadvisable, but also near impossible. How does socialism leap over this hurdle? Thanks to learning the errors and successes of former socialist experiments, we now realize that the slow transition from private plots to collective farms and finally industrial state farms is the correct course if we want to maintain harmony with the peasant class as well as maintain general stability in the countryside. Back on track though. This talk of collective
Well, the thing is, the entirety of the peasantry could have essentially became more proletarian if you had let them essentially control onto their own lands, and especially let proletarians as well produce onto their lands as well, and so that way they themselves can essentially control onto their own industrialization for their own production use without the use of capitulating to the world market. Instead, industrialize through their own means onto their own production forces, which is something that Trotsky essentially believed in and Trotsky essentially advocated for very much. And not only was this possible, it definitely could have been possible if the entirety of Stalin and especially the Vanguard Party had voted to centralize the entire economy of the USSR a lot earlier than it did when Stalin essentially took power. But obviously, we know now that didn't happen, and we have to suffer with the consequences that it lived. And, the consequences was that, the USSR degenerated. So, now we're talking about the ownership, quote-unquote, different ownerships of socialism, which is very, we're gonna go into, why that's just wrong in so many ways. Keep tuned.
And state ownership generally underpins the differing forms of ownership under socialism. What are those forms, you ask? Well, simple. You have, firstly, ownership by the whole people and collective ownership. As these two forms of ownership exist, it is not feasible to have unpaid allocation of products between the two, a necessary component of abolishing commodity production. For example, within the USSR, the collective farms would produce agricultural goods with the intention of sale on a limited market between the collective farms and the state. Further derived from this, most trade between the state and the collective farms took the form of commodities. This is commodity exchange, meaning commodity production. Side point. Some people also argue that since certain goods, for example consumer goods distributed by the state in shops, are exchanged through money, this too is a component of commodity production. I tend to disagree with this point, as money functions, and historically functioned, differently under socialism, but this is a discussion for another time.
So I just want to essentially go on 2 points essentially we have to understand here, what essentially Hakim is basically saying here. So basically he's trying to say that there's two different ownerships within socialism. There is ownership of the whole people, of freely associated laborers, the actual ownership of production within socialism, entirely of a society based on freely associated labor, very much like communism is, with a stateless, moneyless, classless, stateless society. So yeah. And then collective enterprise ownership, quote unquote. And this is very, very kind of like, I would say, liberal kind of in a way, because what we essentially have to understand here, and essentially have to understand of what basically Hakim is basically saying here, is that we can essentially try and move away from the entirety. He's trying to defend he is admitting the entirety of the USSR as the fault of its economics, because of its own facilitation of capital and commodity production within it. However, he is trying to justify it, basically saying, oh, these are the material conditions, these are all the essential functions, and even then, it still helped the workers. And to this, I will bring about a quote from Marx, where he even goes on to route to a revolution be permanent here, which is actually very interesting. Quote, "But these demands can in no way satisfy the party of the proletariat. While the Democratic Party bourgeois want to bring the revolution to end as quickly as possible, achieving at most the aims already mentioned, in our interest, our task to make the revolution permanent until all the more or less property classes have been driven from their ruling positions, until the proletariat has conquered state power, until the association of the proletarians has progressed significantly far, not only in one country, but in all the leading countries of the world. That competition between the proletarians of these countries ceases, and at least the decisive forces of production are concentrated in the hands of the workers. Our concern cannot simply be to modify private property, but to abolish it. Not to hush up class antagonisms, but to abolish classes. Not to improve the existing society, but to find a new one." Sorry about that. I had fucking water just now, burping. What basically Marx is trying to say here is basically what Bordiga would say. If any left communists are watching this, you're welcome. But fuck you. But still, fuck you. The hell of capitalism is the firm, not the fact that the firm has a boss. That's true. That's basically what Marx is trying to get at here, or at least the final part of that quote. On to the part, our concern cannot simply to modify private property, but to abolish it. Not to hush up class antagonisms, but to abolish classes. Not to improve on the existing society, but to find a new one. That's what Marx is basically saying. That's it. We shouldn't. Our goal as socialists, as the entirety of the workers' state, is the entirety of the start to abolish this very system. That being, we have to abolish the very key functions within this onto the task at hand. However, if we are to understand that the material conditions did not call for this, it is still admitting that, one, there's still capitalist, but the tendency is different, although the tendency means nothing if the economics it does not fit the entirety of the tendency. And two, what am I trying to get at? Fuck, I forgot. Just go on to that one real quick. And yeah, no. Basically, the point is that is that there basically just can't be entirely of just a better form of capitalism. The entirety of our point as socialists is to abolish entirely of key functions of capitalism to move towards socialism. And now moving on to his second point, at least what hit onto like the point that apparently Hakim was trying to get at there at the end of the point there at the end of the section, was that there is money within socialism, which is just not the case. And we have to go back to our last point, our last quote from Lenin as well, talking about, well, the abolition of classes. And if we are to understand the entirety of money in this instance, money is a medium of exchange. It is entirely of a basis where essentially a class can use money to essentially oppress another class, and essentially very much essentially perpetuate power to a state, which the state itself is an instrument of power from a ruling class over a non-ruling class. Therefore, if socialism means the abolition of classes, and essentially classes will disappear entirely in socialism, but will remain the dictatorship of the proletariat, then the entirety of, well, socialism is still entirely is a classless society. And if it's a classless society, that's also a stateless society, because the state is an authority of a ruling class over a non-ruling class. Therefore, it is stateless. And if it's stateless, that's also moneyless, because without state, money cannot circulate within each other, and without class, without state, there is no need for money, because money is what gives a power to the state, and without classes, money cannot circulate from one another. Therefore, it is a moneyless, classless, stateless society. And especially what we understand of Hakim's previous videos beforehand, he is one to admit that socialism is an abolition of classes and that it's somehow classless. However, if you are to admit that it's classless, then you are to admit that it is also stateless and moneyless, because without those key functions, without the class, the state and the money ceases to exist, which is clearly not the case in the USSR. Clearly was not, and we can see this onto its production forces. And we saw this very much within the USSR, and it did have commodity production and production for exchange and trade with the world market. So, yeah, no, it is entirely capitalist still in its very function, very much so. Anyways, yeah, moving on.
By the whole people existed does not make it capitalist commodity production. Socialist commodity production differed, primarily in that the economic exploitation of workers through the extraction of surplus value did not exist, and nor did market functions determine production, with commodity.
It did. It simply did. To understand this is that we have to understand the entirety of a class in the first place. Classes are the social relations of the means of production. That's how Marx defined it. Notice how Marx defined classes. It is the social relations to the means of production. And to understand that, we have to essentially understand what this essentially can mean for a state, and what basically what goes in on here is that the fact that there can essentially be a third division of labor that can constitute a class. Fredrick Engels goes in on this in Anti-Capitalism, where he even says the following quote, "A third division of labor was added by the civilization, created a class that did not take part in production nor occupied itself in the merely of exchange of products. The merchants, all former attempts of the class formation, were exclusively concerned with production. The divided producers into directors and directed or into producers on a more or less extensive scale. But here a class appears on the first time that captures the control of production. In general, the subjects unto the producers to its rule, without taking at the least part in production, a class that makes itself the indispensable mediator between the two producers and exploits them both under the pretext of saving them and the trouble of the risk of exchange, of extending the markets onto their products to distinct regions and into the becoming and of thus becoming the most useful class in society, a class of parasites, genuine social ingemons, that skim the cream of production at home and abroad at the reward of the very insignificant services that rapidly amass enormous wealth, gain social significance, accordingly that for this reason reap ever new honors and ever greater control of production during the period of civilization, until they at last, being in the light of product of their own periodical crisis in industry. End quote. Fredrick Engels. He talks about that in Anti-During, and essentially goes on that, talking about that entire economical structure within it, and that's entirely of a problem that essentially we have to understand here, that that class can essentially be created and essentially be abstracted and have a control on production without essentially being physical, and the entirety of the state, although being an instrument of class antagonisms, can essentially have a control into production, because classes is a social relation to the means of production. That's what basically Fredrick Engels is trying to get at here, and even that, just because the entirety of surplus value is not essentially being stolen, which it was, actually, I'll scratch that. It was being stolen, because surplus value is essentially, when surplus value is basically being stolen, there is entirely an accumulation of labor, and that there is an accumulation of labor that means capital, and essentially capital consists with entirely of essentially exchange value and commodities essentially being sold into the world market. That is essentially being very, very capitalist. That is entirely capitalistic in a function, in a way. That is entirely surplus stealing. If you are to admit that there is commodity production within the USSR, then you are admitting that there exists capital, and there exists entirely of surplus value essentially being stolen from the entirety of the worker. There is no such thing as socialist commodity production or commodity production for the betterment of the workers. Commodity production as a function is entirely production for exchange value, and essentially still calls for an exploitative measure that capitalism has brought, even before the USSR, that Marx goes in on in his economical manuscripts and his economical his economical works and his philosophical works as well, before he essentially derived onto the organization of the communists. So, yeah. Anyways, moving on.
Of the circumstances. Furthermore, there was no market for labor power to be exchanged as a commodity, as employment was guaranteed by the state, and during the best times, managers did not have the right to hire and fire, and at the worst, had incredibly limited power in this regard.
But the thing is that what I have to understand is that the world market still exists, and that the USSR still traded with the entirety of the United States and various other world powers to essentially get profit from the grain that they essentially produce in the first place, for it being isolated. Being isolated and essentially being isolated and being with the rest of the capitalist world, that it had to essentially cave in to capitalists. It capitulated to them. They capitulated to capitalists. That is them essentially being capitalist. It doesn't necessarily, just when they are participating into the world market, they themselves are having markets within its function as well. Because markets is an international relation. Just know that for a fact. Anyone at all. If you're a Marxist, if you consider yourself that, then that is essentially the notion. Markets is an international function. Anyways, moving on.
Nevertheless, even socialist commodity production reproduced bourgeois right, and as a result gave impetus to the socialist necessity that is abolishing commodity production. So, does that mean that we want to rid ourselves of commodity production? Of course, you will not find a single Marxist that wants the perpetual continuation of commodity production. However, an understanding of the facts and material conditions is necessary. Commodity production is not a button we press to turn on or off. Its elimination, like the construction of socialism, is a process that is gradual and will take place through numerous steps and many years. This entails eliminating the material conditions that give rise to commodity production, which entails, for example, within socialist nations of agrarian or semi-feudal origin, the gradual transition away from collective farm production, amongst other things. Political considerations, the relationship between the peasantry and the proletariat, national stability, and many other things need to be taken into account. With that also in mind, we have to also realize that the existence of numerous modes of production can be present at one time or different times within a single nation, as Lenin illustrated in the aforementioned essay. Essentially, making reductionist claims of not socialism because commodity production, no. As you may imagine, things are always more complicated. Finally,
so what I'm basically just going to say here is that one, actually, hold on, let me be right back. So I basically just wanted to say that basically saying that the entirety of the material conditions essentially called for commodity production within its functions still constitutes it still being capitalist. When there's entirely of a capitalist there's a capitalist entirely like foundation within its essential country that is essentially being capitalist in a function that's essentially ceased to exist socialism within its very functions as well. Obviously, and number two, people do take into the considerations of the material conditions of commodity production. Left communists have done that, Trotskyists, neo-Trotskyists, Marxist humanists. Many people have done that so many times, and they do take into consideration of the material conditions. However, when we do take into consideration of the material conditions, we can see that there's actually many other decisions that Lenin, or like specifically Stalin, could have made earlier that essentially would stop this essentially from happening, and essentially let the proletariat decide onto their own material function. But because of the entirety of what he considered as what was needed for the material conditions of Russia, there was entirely a bureaucratic regime essentially set up within Russia that will cause the degeneration of the Soviet Union to state capitalism, which is very much the case where it had commodity production by the times of 1932. It had commodity production, it had private property, it had various foundations of capitalism. And it capitulated entirely to the world market as well during this time. It was capitalist. It did have entirely of capitalist structures within its nations. That is entirely perpetuating capital and like essentially that's perpetuating capital and which capital is the accumulation of labor. That is capitalist regardless. Furthermore, and onto and number three, you cannot have entirely of a mode of production or multiple mode of productions at once. Okay, you can have essentially old laws of economics within the entirety of mode of production and distribution, which is something that essentially Russia did have with a feudal law during its in the mode of production of its capitalism, obviously. However, that's not essentially two modes of production. That is a law into the mode of production, and that's essentially what even Marx goes in on of the bourgeois law. Mode of a bourgeois law in the mode of distribution within socialism, as what's constituted as the lower phase of communism. That's essentially what to understand here. That's not multiple modes of production. Socialism and communism is not a fucking dial, alright? We're talking about economic systems, alright, here, and economic systems are defined by the means of production and distribution and the mode of production and distribution. We're talking about economic systems here. We're not talking about your dad's thermostat. We're not talking about your locker combination here, okay? We're not talking about your dad's thermostat. We're talking about economics and the entirety of economical situations of the mode of production, mode of distribution, means of production, and means of distribution as well. We're talking about that. And because of this, no, you can't essentially have multiple modes of production at once. You have laws into the mode of production, economical laws into the mode of production and mode of distribution. That does not essentially constitute multiple modes of productions or multiple modes of distributions. Marx goes in on this very much, and Engels and Lenin as well in on this in various other works and economical works, even before Imperialism had State Capitalism, even before Anti-During, and even before Capital. So yes, that's one thing that we essentially have to understand here. So, like socialism and communism, capitalism and feudalism, slavery, and all these, they're not dials. Okay, they're not fucking thermostats. They're economic systems. They're defined by a character within. They're defined by the entirety of production and distribution, how it functions within it. That's what they're defined as. Anyways, moving on.
Complicated. Finally, a frequently neglected point in the commodity production discussion is this. Historically, global socialist revolution has not occurred. What has occurred is a single locus of revolution from which support and inspiration causes several revolutions to erupt nearby with limited levels of success. As a result, many socialist nations had to develop essentially on their own. As no nation on earth is fully self-sufficient in all its needs, this means that they needed to engage in some level of international trade. This engagement served two functions. Firstly, to buy foreign products of various kinds that are not available or cannot be produced within said socialist nation, and secondly, to sell product on the global market in order to acquire hard currency used for the first function mentioned. This would logically require said socialist nations to engage in some level of commodity production in order to produce goods that can be sold on the global market. This presents us with a political dilemma. Either we establish world revolution in order to circumvent the basic requirement of global trade for unpaid allocation of resources between nations, and hence aiding the full abolishment of commodity production, or we take Menshevik positions of believing that revolution, if not global, and especially in agrarian or semi-feudal nations, is inadvisable if not impossible. The first option is ideal, but unrealistic. The second is just plain silly. Marxists reject both options and choose the only path that has been historically possible. Conquer state power in as many places as possible, begin the construction of socialism, and support global movements, wherever they are, towards their aims of building a new and just society, not based on the exploitation of man, but on mutual cooperation and development.
This is close to the end of the video, and I'm going to go on my final point here, but this isn't my final point. To basically understand and to respond to this is basically just to understand this. One, revolutions will entirely be international. We have entirely of a world market, and this world market entirely will essentially be international. Obviously, this revolution won't be inherently always international and take place until like spontaneously at once, because Lenin does go in on that in Tax and Kind. I'm not denying that. However, we are to still understand that this will essentially be a international revolution, for the entirety of the world market does exist within its economics, and essentially will have to constitute for a revolution. And essentially, even then, basically, kind of like Marx, even himself, kind of like goes in on this. Like, not Marx, Fredrick Engels goes in on this as well. My bad. Shit, man. Okay, while I'm trying to get the entirety of the quote, has like a lot of fucking revolution. Holy shit. Bear with me here. Oh my god, shit. Okay, even says here from Fredrick Engels as well, in Principles of Communism, the 19th question, quote, will it be possible for this revolution to take place in one country alone? No, by creating the world market, and big industry has already brought all the peoples on the earth, and especially the civilized peoples, into such a close relation with one another, it does that none is independent what happens to others. Further, it has core-oriented the social development of civilized countries to such an extent that in all of them, bourgeoisie and proletariat have become the decisive classes, and the struggle between them, the great struggle of the day. It follows the communist revolution will not merely say at least in England, America, France, and Germany. It will develop each of those countries more or less rapidly, according as one country or the other has has a more developed industry, greater wealth, and more significant mass of production forces. Hence, it will go to the slowest and will meet onto the most obstacles in Germany and will rapidly with the fewest difficulties in England. It will have powerful impact on the other countries of the world and will radically alter the course of development which they have followed up to now, while greatly stepping up its pace. It's a universal revolution and will accordingly have a universal range. End quote, Fredrick Engels. So that's basically what Fredrick Engels is going in there. And then as for kind of like and that's basically my first point. The second point is that basically the material conditions and the entirety of the material conditions of central countries that basically Hakim is talking about here, again, that is the very much reasons of why exactly it was capitalist. It doesn't necessarily, you can bring up as much material conditions as you want to, but the tendency does not outweigh the entirety of the economics. The tendency is still very much a desire, but that does not essentially constitute its economics as well. And I'll go on that in my very final point that I just like to basically just throw at Hakim here. But you can basically talk about all the material conditions you want, that it would need to do that, it had to do that. Okay, but if it doesn't matter if they had to do that, the fact that they are doing that is still perpetuating essentially capitalist. At the end of the day, the economics matters, and the economics matter more than the tendency. That's one thing I have to understand here. And as for the third one, obviously we are to conquer state power, and we are essentially create the entirety of a state, essentially controlled by the workers, where they have the control of the state, production and distribution as well, based onto their own planning and based onto their own control on production, based onto their own democratic structure. However, that is because it calls for international revolution to be permanent in the entirety of a state to essentially perpetuate itself and centralize based onto the means of the working class themselves, to create entirely a revolution based onto their own structure, where they can essentially make that revolution permanent and create that entirety of the international revolution, because revolutions are planned, and revolutions are essentially planned and decisive in its works. That is entirely the revolution. That's why there is even state power in the first place. If you're a Marxist, you will understand this, but you understand this because there is a call for an international revolution, and there always will be, and we have to understand this, and this has to be done entirely of the leading countries. There will be attempts to try and do it in the weakest links into capitalism, but that will not give into any functions into capitalism. We have to strike at the heart of capitalism. We have to strike at the bare heart of capitalism, at the fucking core. And where is that? Well, the United States of America, the leading countries. And anyways, to go on my final point.
If you're interested in some quick reading to further discuss all of this, give Stalin's Economic Problems of the USSR a read, along with Lenin's Attacks in Kind, and Chapter 5 of a book titled China's Socialist Economy by Shui Mukia. I'll write the name on the screen. Also, give my Was the USSR Socialist video a watch for a deeper dive over there.
All I really wanted to say here is that, or essentially provide here, is that he basically recommends people here to watch or to read Lenin's Attacks in Kind, when I actually even have a quote here from Attacks in Kind as well, or at least in a section of Attacks in Kind, where there's essentially a transcript where he is speaking to Russian workers and Russian peasants as well, where he even says here, quote, "No one, I think, in studying the question of the economic system of Russia has denied its transitional character, nor I think has any communist denied that the term Soviet Socialist Republic implies the determination, the keyword, determination of Soviet power to achieve the transition to socialism, and not that the existing economic system has recognized as a socialist order." End quote, Vladimir Lenin. So basically, Lenin is basically saying here that it has the desire to achieve socialism, not that it was socialist entirely. You cannot recognize it. You can only recognize it as a socialist order and call it socialist based on its tendency. But the tendency does not outweigh the economics, and the economics is still the final say within the structures and within the entirety of the structures of nation states and the entirety of economics when we define its economic character and out as Marxists to define the functions of economic systems. Anyways, that's all for today, folks. Thank you for watching this video. If you're new to my channel, hit the like button down below. I'd very much appreciate it. Sorry for this video being long. I just wanted to make a very good response to this. And yeah, if you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button. I would very much appreciate it. And yeah, do check out the entirety of the sources that I'll have a link down in the description that talks about basically what I've been saying here this entire time. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. And yeah, Socialist Lynx is out. See you guys.